Thanks to everyone for jumping on here. These are interesting times, especially with the hafnium vulnerabilities that are running around. It's all the more timely to be having this discussion here today. So as Steve mentioned, Greg Rosenberg, I'm a senior manager. I have a bunch of sales engineers on my team to help people not only understand how threat hunting works, but how it relates to you and your customers here today. I've got an agenda where I essentially want to accomplish two goals. Number one, I want to help everyone understand why you as an MSP would want to perform threat hunting for you and your customers. And number two, I also want to talk about the service here at a high level. But clearly we need to make sure that we understand where the needs are and why someone would want to pursue MTR in this particular case. So let me kind of outline at least three use cases here first. The first example is what we really refer to as an advanced attack, commonly referred to as living off the land. I'll also identify suspicious files in this particular case, and then also talk about general hygiene as these three use cases. And then from there, we'll dovetail into what it is that you can be doing and how the service works. Number one, when we talk to customers and they ask the question, how do I get the best protection? I think as an industry, we've always kind of deferred to the common answers, and that is, well, you need really the best endpoint protection, or you need to have a really good firewall, and then there's some other ancillary services that you can also have, things like email protection. Those things are largely true. In other words, you should have those in place as a baseline, but we have to make sure that we understand the intent behind the question itself. What someone is really asking is, how do I maximize an investment to have the highest degree of confidence that I will not suffer an attack and an eventual, result of an attack, like a ransomware outbreak, or in this particular case with hafnium, data exfiltration or other advanced activity. And so the first point that I always try to make with everyone is that endpoint protection is necessary, but it will not be able to detect and respond to every single attack that is out there today. And so the best example that I can provide is what we refer to as living off of the land attacks. So for those of you who haven't heard that term before, the best way to think about it is that there are a lot of tools that natively run on customers' machines. So in a Windows environment, tools like PowerShell or PSKill, or even administrative tools that are legitimate but can be used illegitimately by an adversary. These are extremely popular by a lot of the adversary groups that we see right now. So I've got an example here of a situation where we've conducted a lot of threat hunts, and we do that today with the managed threat response service that we leverage. And in this particular situation, we were looking for Base64 encoding. And the reason that we were looking at Base64 encoding is because it's a common vector that attackers are using. So the question becomes, for you and the customers that you serve, is number one, how do you look for legitimate tools being used illegitimately? So here's a good example. Base64, you don't have to know the literal definition of what it is. It's technically machine code. It's something that is designed to be interpreted so that instructions can be fed into a processor. The real world definition is, if someone is running a PowerShell script and it's encoded with Base64, you can't make heads or tails of it. So I'll contrast that with other encoding schemes that we're more commonly aware of, what are thought of as human readable, where you can actually look at a PowerShell script and see things like a URL, or you can see a file path, or you can see a user in a lot of scenarios and be like, this script just popped up on my screen. I don't know why this is running. This particular user probably shouldn't be doing whatever it is that it's trying to do. And a lot of times you'll get someone who picks up the phone and calls you and says, something funny is going on here. That's the best way that we see output from these types of situations. And so what the adversaries have attempted to do is to obfuscate their activity. So this is an actual sample of Base64 encoding. You'll see strings like x68, x74, and you'll just look at them and be like, that's something that an administrator did or my MSP did, and they're just trying to update some system settings or install a piece of software. And so what I've done in this particular situation is I've decoded this string of data, and you can see that if someone were to see this particular URL, they'd raise their hand, they go, I now recognize that this is bad. So this is an example that we commonly use to say there are legitimate tools that can be used illegitimately. Does InterceptX Advanced provide some protection against this type of encoding? The answer is yes, but there are limits to what it can do based on the operating system that you're running, and also based on the fact that you can actually nest multiple scripting utilities 6 or 7 layers deep, and you can't dig into all those nested layers of scripting as a result. Now, the reason I want to highlight Hafnium is that it's directly related to identifying this activity and being able to block or neutralize the threat. So for those of you who are unaware, Microsoft announced 4 vulnerabilities last week that affect Microsoft Exchange. So this does not impact O365 users, but essentially it impacts every version of Microsoft Exchange. And the vulnerabilities essentially cover 2 areas. The first is if the vulnerability is exploited, it allows for remote code execution. And one of those 4 vulnerabilities allows for essentially data theft or data exfiltration. My team personally has engaged in over 100 customers that are running Exchange. Every single customer that we have spoken with that is running Exchange has been impacted by these vulnerabilities. We're kind of sounding the alarm. We're doing a lot of communication on this. But I want you to understand right now, if you have a customer that is running Exchange, it is almost a certainty that they are impacted by this. In other words, we have seen exploit activity related to it. The adversaries are now instantiating what's called a web shell, which essentially allows them to be administrator remotely on those Exchange servers. We're also seeing in a lot of these cases where they are either pulling back the mailboxes or exploring the mailboxes themselves for data theft. But we've now also seen over the last couple of days that adversaries have been moving laterally with that web shell access to hit other servers. And we think there's another shoe to be dropped in most of these situations. So at least in my experience, this is probably one of the most significant set of vulnerabilities that we have seen here. And frankly, most tools that live on endpoints and servers are largely blind to this. They're just not designed to just pick up on vulnerabilities in and of themselves. Technically, the vulnerabilities have been known to the adversary community since at least January, probably earlier. Microsoft released a patch 1 week ago today, but even if you patch those systems, it doesn't necessarily clean up the artifacts from this and the adversary access, depending on what the adversary has done. So this is going to impact hundreds of thousands of organizations worldwide. So if nothing else, I implore you, if you know of your customers running any version of Exchange, even if you don't support it, you need to contact them immediately. We've got some links that we can share after the meeting here today. But that's the point, right? You can't block everything. You can't account for every vulnerability that's being exploited in the wild, but you can actually take steps to identify suspicious activity. And that's something that you can only do with threat hunting when you ask really broad questions like, hey, do you see examples of web shells being run? If so, let's ask questions about it. So that's really the first use case that I wanted to highlight with this group, is that there are advanced activities that frankly software in and of itself can't detect because they're using legitimate tools just in a way that is to their advantage. The second use case I want to cover for the group is this notion of executable files. So another example of where InterceptX Advanced has fantastic data science. In other words, if you come across an executable file, whether it's via InterceptX Advanced or some other product, and you haven't seen it before, we broadly ask the question, how similar does this executable file look to other malware that we've seen before, or frankly, other benignware, good stuff that's out there? And, you know, it's an interesting conundrum. In other words, we set a threshold where we don't convict everything that's suspicious, because if we did, then that would essentially mean we would block a lot of legitimate applications from running. And I'm sure a lot of customers would pick up the phone and call you and say, what in the heck is this software doing? I can't do my job. And there's still some of that happens with every endpoint protection product that has a machine learning component. There's always this delicate trade-off that you're balancing. So there's a certain threshold where we say, this looks really suspicious, we're going to block it. There's also a threshold on the other end of the spectrum where we say, we know this is benign, we won't touch that one. But there's this middle ground where there are some attributes, maybe it has to do with file entropy. Maybe it has to do with DLL files that it's using. Maybe it's a piece of software trying to run out of a different directory. So not the program files directory, but maybe out of a user directory. Maybe it's just because it's a custom application and the developer has poor development practices or doesn't understand what's considered best coding practices. There's a lot of examples where software will fall into that middle ground. And the question then becomes, what do you do about it, right? Who's going to make that determination that there's a piece of software that's at least sitting there on one of your customers' systems? EDR is great, right? We have a tool that's available, and I'm showing an example of this right now, but it is a tool in and of itself that you can use to investigate executable files. You need someone who's constantly using that tool, though, to make use of it. And this is true with any vendor that's out there. Is how do I determine if what I'm looking at, this suspicious executable file, is in fact malicious? Well, you've got the tools to do it, but then the question is, do I have enough butts and seats to do it? I always kind of talk about it in this term of thinking, and that is, if I'm not running these threat hunts 24/7, not during normal business hours, but if I'm not doing this for my customers 3 a.m. on a Sunday, which is when a lot of the attackers hit, then it doesn't really do you any good. You still just have information lying dormant, waiting to be touched. So I always share with people, you have to look at the suspicious stuff 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So that's the second question that you have to ask is, hey, customer, how do you look at these suspicious files here today? Who's monitoring for it? Who do you want to monitor for it? And you have to ask that question yourself internally as an MSP. Am I going to do it as well? So the third use case, and this is the one that kind of drives me a little bit batty, and that is that it comes down to general hygiene. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of things that we know that we should be doing. with Hafnium, a good example is applying patches as soon as possible. But even if you applied the patch, you still probably could have been exploited. But just like that, even if you're using InterceptX Advanced for your customers, I always ask the question, do you have every single protection turned on? What do your exclusions look like? So one of the challenges I think we see in the MSP space, obviously with the use of RMM and PSA tools, is that, frankly, a lot of those tools, again, rely on those same administrative tools. So, you don't have to raise your hand publicly here, but if you have exclusions in place for things like PS exec, which, you have to have in place, or you need some other form of remote management tools, TeamViewer, RDP, that's great. But bear in mind that the adversaries also love the use of those tools. So if you've provided exclusions or whitelists for those, or you slip up and you just have an exclusion that you meant to only put in there temporarily, or you turn off deep learning, or you haven't enabled all of the exploit mitigations that are available in InterceptX Advanced, the attacker doesn't care, right? Whether or not, we had cycles or, customers were necessarily complaining about incompatibilities with applications. All the attacker cares about is, scanning environments or looking specifically for MSPs, because they know that you have broad access to a number of customers. So it's an efficient way to attack a bunch of organizations. And they know that a lot of these tools rely on these same resources that give them essentially the keys to the kingdom. So my point to everyone is, you want someone who's monitoring for these vulnerabilities and these misconfigurations and making sure that all the protections are turned on a regular basis, because the moment that you slip up is the moment that someone will take advantage of that slip up, and generally they'll do so relatively quickly and with an immense amount of damage. So what a lot of people are not aware of yet is that Sophos has an incident response service. We call it rapid response. The number one thing that we look at are things like, hey, you actually have a good product in place, whether it's ours or others, but we actually look at the configuration or posture of those settings. So if this is something that you're not reviewing on a regular basis and you're trying to narrow the scope down as much as possible, whether it be exclusions or turning off protections, you need, please, I beg of you, you need to do this on a regular basis. I think the other point, though, that then becomes obvious is that there are probably other tools beyond, obviously, the Sophos set, that if you do manage, whether it be a third-party firewall, an intrusion detection system, these are just products in and of themselves, and you have to take the same approach to these. You need someone reviewing the change control process, making sure those exclusions are written as specifically as possible, and then not assuming that those exclusions should hold, 1 year from now or 2 years from now. So one of the best steps that you can take today is to go back into your various consoles and look for any protections that are disabled. Look for users that shouldn't be in there, look for exclusions, and either remove them or tighten them up as quickly as possible. Okay, so the question then becomes, how do we stop this? Or at least how do we get to this notion of best protection? And Sophos MTR is an option. And the best way to think about it is that it's threat hunting enabled by good software. Right? So we've built our solution over the top of InterceptX Advanced. And the reason that we chose to do that is that we want to filter out as much noise as possible. In other words, if you were to take, a not as great endpoint and server protection product that's out there, essentially you have to then threat hunt for other indicators that just aren't blocked natively. And what that means is you essentially fill up a dashboard with a whole series of alerts. So the question then becomes, how do I know which of those alerts are legitimate? The second question is, how do I actually prioritize which of these to look at first? If I'm just letting in a whole flood of actions that a better endpoint or server protection product can block natively, then essentially what I'm doing is I'm being inefficient. You're essentially bearing the cost operationally of what should be a cost of a license, is the best way to think about it. So what Sophos MTR does is we run threat hunts 24/7. We ask really broad questions like, show me all of the network traffic not running over ports 80 and 443 over the last 10 minutes. So we might see an example of 3389, which is RDP. RDP traffic is in and of itself a legitimate tool and can be legitimate traffic, but we also see RDP that is not properly secured exploited by adversaries to get an initial foothold in organizational environments. So that's one of the reasons we ask that question, is not only for RDP, but other anomalous network traffic are good indicators. So we actually ask over 250 questions at various times throughout the day. So in some cases, once every few minutes, some cases once a day, just depends on the nature of the threat hunt that we're running. We ingest that data. If we actually get any positive results where you've got a server that says, yes, I see port 3389, we run it through a series of rules and models. And if it matches a rule or it breaks through a threshold on a model, it drops into a queue for a human to analyze. It becomes what we call a case. And this is where you really need humans to actually make determinations, to ask follow-on questions. So in this case, if we see 3389 traffic, well, we might ask a follow-on question like, what's the source IP address? Is this coming from Russia or Topeka? We might ask the user that's leveraging it. We might actually see how much traffic and when that traffic is flowing. But we can also ask questions about user behavior, browser extensions, file changes. The questions really are quite broad, and you need the human to be able to determine whether or not something is malicious. If we make a determination then that something is in fact malicious, what's really unique about the service is that we can take action. And this is really critical, right? When your customers are asking the question, do I have protection or can I have the best protection? It does you no good if the MDR provider is just saying to you at 3 a.m, we found something bad, MSP, go clean it up. Here's a bunch of registered keys. Our approach is we will remediate the threat to the best of our ability. So we will essentially hunt it down, block the threat, and then send you a notification afterward that we've cleaned this up on behalf of you and the customer in this particular situation, if you allow us to do so. We can also work with you collaboratively, where if you have other systems that you administer, we can share with you the remediation advice, configuration changes that need to take place. But that's really the best way to think about an MDR service. Is not only should it be threat hunting, looking for the needle in the haystack or the use of these other indicators that I've alluded to, but if they find something, the question becomes, can they take action? It's the R in managed detection and response. And I always like to say, you know, there's a lowercase r and there's an uppercase R. Response is not telling you how to fix it at 3 a.m. Response is not isolating a system. Response is cleaning the threat. And that's really what these customers are asking for in these particular use cases when something bad does happen. All right, Steve, I'm going to pull you back in here because I see that we've got some questions already popping up here. So
I'm actually glad you took a break here. So
yeah.
We have a question. Basically, thank you for all the the technical knowledge on here. But looking for more of a way to talk to a customer that's not going to have the technical skills or understand what goes on in the back end. How would you recommend communicating this information and what is needed here in a non-technical way to
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fair question. So the first point that I would make, if you kind of consider these use cases, you can ask really broad questions. Number one, how are you looking for advanced threats 24 hours a day? Right? That's a question that I ask everyone, whether they be large or small. I always like to say that, most of the attacks that we see take place happen outside of normal business hours and especially on the weekends. So the question is, do you have a team that literally is monitoring alerts, whatever those alerts are? You don't have to be mindful of the technical details, but are they monitoring these alerts 24/7? So the first part of this is really just a math problem, right? If you consider that you would need, someone to do the 3 shifts per day on the weekdays, which is, 3 people. And then you probably need another 2 people to cover the weekends. And that's assuming you don't have vacations or holidays or, sick time, things like that. So you probably need at least 5 or 6 people, but this is all they're doing. How do you monitor for people using your legitimate tools illegitimately? That's the best way I would think about it, because that's where a lot of the attacks are happening right now. The second question, I think the question is, can we share some data? Yes, absolutely, Steve. I'll provide some links to the case books on how we interfered with some of these advanced attacks. There's a really good example, in fact, that we uncovered about a month ago. This was a new variant of a piece of ransomware dubbed Conti. And you can kind of think of it as a piece of software, but really a group of advanced adversaries. They were targeting a customer that had about 400 devices in total. So it was roughly 350 endpoints and about 50 servers. So it's not like this is a large enterprise customer. The interesting thing was this organization was going through the process of being acquired in this case. And the attackers were using essentially a piece of software. The trick was that, someone actually had clicked on a link, as we kind of hear about quite often. That provided the initial foothold where we had what's known as command and control traffic. In other words, they could actually observe traffic here remotely. What was really interesting about this is that initial foothold allowed the software to automatically propagate to a whole bunch of other systems throughout the environment. So they then gained footholds without someone being hands-on keyboard to a whole bunch of other systems. And then the attacker could kind of figure out where the interesting data lived at that point, but do so very evasively. In other words, they weren't going to trip off any alarms because they were using command prompt for the most part, and another tool called WMI. So the question becomes, how do you monitor, adversaries or someone using a legitimate tool illegitimately in this case? And how do you monitor for some of these advanced tactics as they emerge? It can't just be software alone. So if they're worried about advanced attacks that are out there, and they should be, because frankly, they hit even SMB customers quite regularly. The bulk of our incident response engagements are actually customers that are about 100 devices or under. I think the question becomes, do you have data that is important to you, that if it were encrypted and unrecoverable, even if they have backups, unrecoverable, or if it were leaked online, that's one part of the question that they have to answer. The second part, and the way a lot of these adversaries gain leverage, is what would happen if your domain controller and your mail server and all your key application servers were offline? Because when they get hit with an attack, that is what will be targeted. They will bring all these systems offline. And so the question that most organizations ask my team when there is an attack is, when can I get my systems back up? And we essentially tell them, look, you have to disconnect your network right now because allowing the full network access allows the adversary to respond to anything that you do here. So that's another question I would ask is, what would you do if all your systems were offline for 48 hours, 72 hours? I mean, they'll be lucky to just get out of triage after 2 days, even with a really fast incident response service like we have. So hopefully that helps keep it simple, and then we'll provide some case books after the webinar.
I think to add to that a little bit, when you're talking to a customer as an MSP, and you are already offering Sophos, Intercept X, Intercept X, as Greg mentioned here, it is working around the clock. It is taking a look at all the attacks that are happening on the machine. But what it's not able to do, and really where that that threat hunter and where MTR comes in, is what about that person that clicked on that phishing email, maybe late on a Friday and got a bad actor into the environment, and that person is now they're not doing anything malicious at that point. They're just poking around. How does the customer understand over the course of the weekend, you as the MSP, you're going and taking off the weekends unless you have a SOC team that, again, to Greg's point, is working 24/7, 365. Who's monitoring the activity that's happening during those downtimes? And really, that's where MTR comes in.
That's right. And there's other things beyond what a product can do on its own. So this hafnium activity is a great example. If there is a vulnerability, that's just viewed as legitimate activity. Just having a web shell, an administrative tool, is legitimate activity by itself. That by itself will not trigger an endpoint protection product or a firewall to fire off a rule and block the activity natively. You have to have probably a complex set of rules or actions associated with it to trigger an alarm. So there's vulnerabilities, obviously, that can be exploited. So if we're not patching immediately, and even customers that patched, when Microsoft released these patches on Tuesday, well, the vulnerability has been known by a lot of people since January. It doesn't matter that you patched. It doesn't actually even clean up the threat once they've gotten in there. So even if you identify something bad, how do you remediate the threat once you've provided access? And then there's other things beyond the purview as well of all these different security products, and that is just configuration, right? How do you ensure that you have the best configuration possible? So if you have products that are custom software or exclusions in products or firewall rules that are being permissive, by definition, you are opening up holes to these organizations to provide access. So how do you monitor how that access is then utilized as well?
Perfect. So I got another question for you on here. This one is around the virtual appliance for, I'm guessing, the XG.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, with the virtual appliance you install, if you don't have an XG, are you basically setting up a span port on the switch to pull the traffic information, kind of like how Alien Vault does this?
No, so that's a good question. So there are essentially two flavors of managed detection and response providers out there. There's network focused, which these vendors generally utilize a SIM where logs are sent off. And then there's endpoint and server focused. We fall into the latter category, and I'll talk about why that is. But I'll also contrast that to say that generally, especially for most customers that this group is servicing, SIM and network MDR is largely ineffective. I'm just going to put it out there right now. It's kind of the 80-20 rule. The best way to think about it is, SIM vendors say, well, we want logs from as many systems as possible. Give me your firewall logs. Give me your IDS logs. Give me your access point logs. And then provide to me your endpoint logs. Well, great. If you were to feed in Intercept X advanced logs, it's not even the EDR. You're not doing threat hunting. What you're doing is you're feeding logs in, and what most of these providers actually do is, for the most part, they just do what's called correlation. In other words, they ingest threat feeds or threat intelligence feeds where there are indicators that have been identified as being part of attacks. And most commonly, these indicators are IP addresses, URLs, domains, etc. And then they look in all these logs and they say, do you see an IP address or a domain in any of these logs? If yes, oh, that looks bad, then they notify you that something is now suspicious. Maybe they'll take it a step further in some of these situations, but there's essentially two problems with this approach. The first is that most threat intelligence feeds are not very valuable. In fact, I came from a world where I dealt with threat feeds. Most of these indicators have an effective life of 2 weeks or less. By the time they actually ingest a threat feed and run their hunt, in most cases, that 2-week period has already elapsed. So most of the stuff that they're correlating against just isn't even legitimate any longer, and it becomes a goose chase. The second problem is that they're not actually doing deep threat hunting. So I always like to say that network-based MDR tries to go wide by covering every single piece of infrastructure, when the truth of the matter is you need to go deep on the most targeted infrastructure. In other words, we need to find out if someone is escalating privileges, right? If someone clicks that link that Steve alluded to, how do you actually know that someone tried to go from a regular user to being an administrator with all the rights that come with it? You're not going to get that out of a network MDR provider for the most part. And in fact, we've seen this with our rapid response service. We actually have a bunch of network MDR customers who have been hit because they didn't have the visibility. So things like privilege escalation. When one of these scripts or utilities run, network MDR providers are largely blind to it. These executable files that I was referring to earlier, they also are blind to that activity. So most of what an adversary does happens on the endpoints and servers. Just like with this Hafnium activity right now, they would not see that for the most part. So the short answer is no, that the service is built over the top of InterceptX Advanced. It's an additional component that when you turn it on, we just start running all these scheduled queries. So it's great for a couple of reasons. Number one, unlike network MDR, there's no baselining period. There's no collector to set up. There's no logs that you have to push. There's no worry about logs being retained and then learning about those over 2 weeks or 4 weeks, or even in some cases, 3 months. The service is then active minute one, but more importantly, it provides the visibility that we need to find most of these threats. And that's just not what you're going to get with a network MDR provider.
So Greg, can you talk a little bit about the MTR sensor, what exactly that is?
Yeah, so we have a network sensor available. Technically, it's the XG firewall right now. You can deploy it in one of two fashions. So the first is you can deploy it as, if you've got customers that are running the XG today and it's on version 18 and you've got central firewall reporting in place. If your customers are on MTR Advanced, we automatically ingest data from those devices. So the best way to think about it is the 80-20 rule. In other words, the bulk of the fidelity lies on the endpoints and servers. However, there are cases where you've got devices without an agent, right? Maybe you've got a piece of infrastructure or mobile devices or IoT. You can probably think of a lot of these examples. And so there can be a case made for gathering additional telemetry over the wire. So if you have the XG available right now as a firewall for your customers, that's great. We literally automatically ingest it, assuming it meets those technical requirements that I mentioned. However, you can also deploy it in sensor mode. You would just essentially put it in tap mode. You would mirror the appropriate traffic over to it. So you'd have to set up a span or a tap off the switch and send the traffic over to it. But I always tell people it's for the traffic that we don't have visibility to, right? So it's most commonly stuff that you don't have an agent running on it. And that's a good use case for leveraging the XG.
So I'm not sure if you know the answer to this one. And I know XDR is not out at this point in time.
Yes.
But I'm assuming we'll have a SKU at some point where you'll be able to do MTR and XDR.
Yeah, so we're finalizing the details in terms of how that will work. There are two flavors of MTR today. There is MTR Standard and MTR Advanced. One of the benefits for MTR Advanced is that we have enhanced telemetry. In other words, connectors like for the XG firewall and for Sophos Cloud Optics. The next connector is going to be for O365. We have not finalized a decision as to whether or not XDR will feed into both tiers of service, because technically you can be a standard customer and you can be an MSP that's purchased XDR. There are interesting tidbits that will live in there. So the short answer is we will have access to it. I just don't know on which service tier, whether it's one or both of them, will make use of it.
Gotcha, thanks. Last question I see on here that just popped in is around Office 365 and when we will have a connector for that.
Yeah. So right now that connector is slated for May release at this point. So we have specific use cases defined in terms of the hunts that we are going to run. Technically, the O365 connector also provides to us Active Directory information here, as your Active Directory or AAD as well. It's a common API interface that catalogs a whole series of events. We are largely focused on a couple of use cases within that connector. The first is business email compromise. So, you know, if someone has some sort of account takeover activity, there's ways that you can identify it via that interface, because that can then be leveraged further on down to compromise other assets as well. The other use case is actually extracting indicators from within the email. So things like phishing emails where we want to identify suspicious attachments or URLs as well, to be able to knock those down even earlier. The kill chain is advantageous for us. I would also share with you, though, that the Active Directory exposure is really compelling to us, though, as well, because we can see things like domain admin accounts that are being created, newly created objects or folders or paths. You know, the mind probably reels as you think about what's exposed in Active Directory as well. So we're very excited to get that rolled in here. It looks like we're going to have that here in May. So
do you know if that'll also be available for, I guess, Office 365 government customers?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer specifically. I don't know that there is a separate interface for government customers beyond just.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
I probably would need more information, but I don't know the answer. If they can send off an example of what they're referencing here. I don't think it's a separate API integration in this case.
Yeah, I don't know on that one either.
Okay.
Before I get to the other one that I really want to touch on here, somebody asked, is the Office 365 connector licensed by tenant or user? So the 365 connector is just going to be part of the MTR advanced component, correct?
That's right. You get it for free. Yeah, so there's no like add-on SKU for it. If you're on MTR Advanced, you get those connectors by default at no additional cost.
Yeah, absolutely. So more reason to be on MTR Advanced. And this actually dovetails nicely into the next question here, which is rapid response included with MTR Advanced?
No, but there's an asterisk here, and I want to make sure that I differentiate here appropriately. MTR, whether it be standard or advanced, includes threat neutralization if you authorize us to do so. So if you if you select authorize for the response mode for your customers, we will neutralize the threat just natively. So, you know, in theory, there's no need for rapid response. Is it theoretically possible that a threat could get past this team? Yes, it is theoretically possible. It's just significantly less likely. The only cases where we've seen issues right now where there's been an active incident are, you know, where customers either only licensed the servers and not the endpoints. Maybe there was a budgetary restriction and there was activity on the endpoints that we just couldn't monitor or they didn't have agents installed on systems as well. Those are the things that are cause for concern. Technically on MTR Advanced, you do get a dedicated incident response lead so they can kind of coordinate all activities. We have responders that are specialized in dealing with this, and they can kind of coordinate if there's what we call adjacency. So if a forensics firm then steps in, or cyber liability insurer or outside legal counsel, they'll be the main point of contact and run point on the cleanup efforts.
So at what point in time, since we're talking about rapid response in there as well, when does rapid response get involved?
Yeah, so just think of them as distinct services. So if you or your customers need rapid response, I have a team that is manned 24/7, where we would essentially just quote it separately. For MSP customers, the way it works is we actually quote directly to the MSP itself, obviously not the end customer in these particular situations. But my team is 24/7. We can normally get on a call within about 10 or 15 minutes or so, identify the scope of the incident in this case. The quoting is a little different than kind of traditional services that are out there, even in Sophos world. And then we provide a statement of work and some specialized terms. And then, we can normally begin an engagement within a matter of hours in most cases. I'm gonna put an asterisk beside this with Hafnium just because of the number of cases that are being worked right now. But think of it as completely distinct from MTR. MTR just has threat neutralization. They get guidance from the rapid response team, and they have their own incident responders. But just think of them as distinct services. But if you do have a customer that is being hit, whether they're Sophos or non-Sophos customers, we will service all of them with rapid response.
Perfect. Yeah, and I definitely see, I'm sure you see a lot more on there, but we definitely want to make sure we move all of the customers, as many as we can, especially if they are concerned about those advanced threats, up to the MTR Advanced. Let's get them on that prior to actually being attacked. And that's actually a good segue to you as the MSP, ensuring that your networks are also covered by MTR Advanced as well. You do have the keys to the kingdom when it comes to the RMM tools and remote access to all of your customers, and you guys are definitely targets. Especially with this Hafnium, if any of you guys are running Exchange servers out there, hosting Exchange servers, you're not Office 365. That is definitely a vulnerability and a way in for the bad guy. And you'd want to make sure you have that 24/7, 365 coverage to ensure that, you're not being attacked. Nobody is utilizing your tools or, snooping around your network looking for, again, those tools are RMM tool components on there.
And can I make another point on this front as well? Normally, there is a restriction where we cannot onboard a customer to MTR that has an active incident. And in most cases, these are ransomware, although that's kind of changing right now with some other interesting factors involved, like the price of Bitcoin. But that being said, we're making an exception in this case for Hafnium just because it's so widespread. I just want everyone to understand the distinction between the two services. There are three things that rapid response provides that MTR will not. Number one, rapid response provides rapid deployment. So the idea is, they either don't have agents installed at all or only partially installed. Rapid deployment is there to actually 24/7 get agents deployed to systems. But not only that, in most of these cases with some sort of incident, the adversary will interfere with the agent, and so not all the services will be healthy. So rapid deployment is included in rapid response, where they'll essentially make sure the agents are whole and being able to provide the forensic data that we need to find out what has happened. The second point that I would make is that rapid response also will work with third-party telemetry. It's an incident response service. So in this case with Hafnium, as an example, they will ingest logs from third-party devices like firewalls. A lot of customers are asking about, has data been exfiltrated? We will make a best effort to figure that out, but just bear in mind there are limitations. In other words, the logs may not exist, or even if they had existed, the adversary might have overwritten them or deleted them or tampered with them in some way, shape, or form. And then the third point that I would make, the distinctions between these two services, is that Rapid response will essentially put together a report at the end of a 45-day engagement outlining a lot of the root cause of the attack. Again, where the data and evidence still exists. So it's a significant report, also includes things like indicators of compromise, the remediation activities. In some cases, this could be like a 20-page report. MTR, on the other hand, does not include the rapid deployment, won't work with third-party telemetry, and they're just going to focus on neutralizing the threat right now. You're not going to see a compendium of a report in these cases, but frankly, that could be all that they care about right now. They won't identify the data exfiltration. So the services are distinct, and I just want everyone to be aware of it. But we are allowing MSPs to onboard, in this case, as an exception, customers who are dealing with hafnium right now. And I would just say, how do I know if I'm dealing with hafnium? If they're running Exchange, you're probably already hit. Like every single example that we've seen, we've observed exploit activity. Microsoft has released some hunts that you can run if you haven't already provided or patched the systems. But even if you did patch, they're still probably being exploited in this case. So if you're running Exchange, customers probably been hit already at this point. Then it becomes a question of what else the attacker has done as a result.
I don't know if this is necessarily an MTR type question, but any updates on Big Sur for Apple? I'm not quite sure if that's a do we support Big Sur or if there's some updates for Apple. As far as our endpoint, yes, we do have support out there. We went GA on 3.4 for Big Sur for Apple and their M1 processor, which is also now supported with Sophos Central. So you can absolutely go ahead and deploy out to those.
Yeah, and the general rule is, well, it is true. If you can install InterceptX Advanced on it, whether it be endpoint or server, MTR will work on it. So it's supported by MTR.
Okay, I don't have any other questions in there. We've got about 8 minutes left. Greg, I don't know if there's anything that you would want to cover on that point. I do see there is one question in there, which I'll answer. Is MTR offered with the on-prem endpoint? And that is going to be no. MTR is only going to be offered on Sophos Central.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there was another question that also touched on SVE or Sophos for virtual environments. It's also not supported over that. It is truly on InterceptX Advanced. It's supported across all the OSs though as well. So Windows, Mac, Linux, doesn't matter. We'll do the threat hunting across all the platforms. So the bring it home question. Yeah, so I just kind of want everyone to think more broadly, and it's probably not lost on this audience because you're offering so many managed services. Sophos projects a significant shift in how a lot of our security is delivered at this point. Right now, from a data science perspective, the best way I kind of think about this is I would not be surprised if the majority of our customers in the next 5 years are on a Sophos managed service, just because of the type of activity that we're seeing right now. To be able to provide effective security requires the human involvement at this point. There's just no getting around, things like misconfigurations, running hunts 24/7 and looking for those advanced tactics, and we'll only expand our visibility as we move forward. So, when the customer asks the question, what's considered best protection, we're telling us and our teams and our partners to start with MTR to answer that. And then if they want to discuss, why that is, we're happy to enumerate it, and I can provide resources to you and your teams to further that conversation.
Perfect. I don't see any other questions in there. We do have about 5 minutes left. If anybody has any pending questions, please let us know. Again, if you have any questions on how to get set up with MTR for you as the partner, please reach out to your either local teams or your local MSP team. That's East MSP, Central MSP, and westmsp@sophos.com. They'll be happy to work with you with the different options that we have available for getting you set up with MTR internally. That way, you can make sure your environment is protected, understand how it works, see the reporting in action if you have anything suspicious inside of your environment. And then that'll also help you better sell it to your customers as well. Okay, we do have one question, and it's not really related to this specifically, but would be, how can Central be used with an air-gapped network? I don't know if you know the answer on that one, Greg. I don't think we have any good answer for that at this point.
Yeah, when I hear the question about air gap, I always kind of think, is it like a true air gap where there's literally no network connection with access to the internet, or is it just kind of something that's heavily restricted? It's unusual that you find something that is truly air gapped in this case, but it tends to be, obviously for government agencies and contractors, or I also see it a lot of manufacturing where there's like a legacy OS that's being supported that they know there's no patches available for. For the latter case where it's just legacy OS, there's not really much you can do. It's just, the same story of try to get them to upgrade so they don't have to maintain an air gap as appropriate. If it's kind of more the, significantly restricted network access, it's possible to poke holes in the firewall.
So the other approach on that for the, again, not the true air gap, but the more restricted, and this is the way I've seen a lot of customers go about this, is they'll actually have, a server or a workstation, that is up to date, that can bridge the gap between both networks. And then you can always use the managed cache option to where, that endpoint is going to point to the managed cache servers to pull its update. It has no internet access. It's still not going to be able to get directly to Sophos Central, but it is going to use that device that is updated, does have access to both networks in order to relay information out to Sophos Central, as well as pull updates from Sophos Central directly from that device.
And I'll add on to that, just so everyone's aware, that works for InterceptX Advanced. It does not work for MTR, because technically today, MTR does not leverage update caches or message relays. That will change. Again, also, it looks like May is the time frame when the whole XDR data lake project goes live here. We're in EAT for it at the moment. But it's technically using a separate MCS stream. So there's technically a separate data flow that goes to the SOC that enables all those scheduled queries and responses that I was referring to earlier. So, in this case, there's not like a proxy is the best way to think about the update cache and message relay kind of sitting in between. So you would need to be able to provide access, and we can link to the knowledge base article that shows the proxy rules and the firewall rules that would need to be in place. If it truly is a full air gap, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. It's
pretty rare that we get a full air gap, a full air gap network.
Yeah.
One question I have on here, and I'll answer this one, and I kind of talked about this a little earlier. We have a question of, is MTR available as a free license for internal use for MSPs? So MTR does provide a cost to us. There are people that are behind the MTR service. It is not just like our standard software that is out there where we are giving that away with an NFR. So there is a cost to running MTR Advanced as a partner. We will do everything we can to make sure we discount that. Again, the teams get pretty creative on that. So reach out to your local team, reach out to your MSP team. They'll work with you on what is the best option for you as a partner to get MTR into your network.